All right, listeners, buckle up, because today we're taking a deep dive into the world of atheism and agnosticism. And not just any old exploration, no. We're going in deep like a philosopher would. You know, all those nuances and arguments and all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to really dissect these concepts, get into the nitty-gritty, explore those arguments, and we'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide, which,
Right.
pretty solid source.
Definitely. So when you hear the word atheism, like, what pops into your head first? You probably already know, right? Like, there are all sorts of ways to define it, even though it seems so straightforward.
Exactly. The average person might just think, oh, someone who doesn't believe in God.
Yeah.
But for a philosopher, we need to get a bit more precise. We're talking about a metaphysical definition.
Metaphysical definition. Ooh, that sounds a little intense. Break it down for me. What do you mean by that?
So in philosophy, atheism is typically understood as this proposition that God does not exist. It's not just like a lack of belief. It's more like a direct statement, a claim about the question of whether God exists.
So it's not just like passively not believing. It's like taking a stance and saying, nope, God's not a thing.
Right, exactly. And that makes a difference because it puts atheism and theism on the same level, philosophically speaking. Now we can argue about it, evaluate whether the claim is true, all that.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see why that matters to a philosopher.
Yeah.
But what about the psychological definition? You mentioned that earlier. Is that important at all philosophically?
Well, if we just stuck with the psychological definition, just not having a belief in God, things get kind of weird. I mean, think about it. Babies, rocks, they wouldn't have beliefs about God. Does that make them atheists?
Uh-huh. That'd be a funny conversation starter. Excuse me, Mr. Rock. Are you an atheist?
Right. It just shows the problem with only focusing on someone's mental state. It doesn't really line up with how we usually talk about atheism, at least in philosophy.
So we're going with the metaphysical definition then. Atheism is the proposition that God does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
It's like making a statement that we can debate, not just describing what's going on in someone's head.
Yeah, exactly. It's about getting into that philosophical debate head on.
All right, so we've got atheism sorted out. But what about its partner in crime, agnosticism? It always seems to get misunderstood.
Agnosticism, it's often portrayed as just like shrugging your shoulders and saying, I don't know. But there's a lot more to it than that. It's way deeper than just being indecisive.
More than just not being able to make up your mind. Okay, I'm interested. Give me the philosopher's take on this agnosticism thing.
Okay, so to get agnosticism, we need to go back in time a bit to the 19th century to meet this guy, T.H. Huxley. He was a biologist, really into evidence-based thinking, and he actually coined the term agnostic. His whole thing was, don't claim you know something if you don't have good enough reasons.
So no jumping to conclusions without the facts. Makes sense, especially for a scientist.
Right. So now apply that to the question of God. Neither theists nor atheists have this, undeniable proof, right? So Huxley's position was basically, hold on, let's not pretend we know for sure until we have more to go on.
So it's not so much about being unsure, but more about being, honest about what we actually know. It's like saying, hey, we just don't know yet,
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's about intellectual honesty. And when you think about how there's no definitive proof about God's existence, well, Huxley thought suspending judgment was the most responsible intellectual position.
Yeah, I get that. Seems kind of presumptuous to say we know for sure whether or not God exists, given the whole, the nature of the question.
For sure. And what's really cool is that agnosticism isn't just one single thing. It's more like a family of views, all with that core idea that we just don't know enough about God to make a knowledge claim.
So the different types of agnosticism, what are some of the variations?
Well, there's agnosticism based on justification, saying I don't have a good enough reason to believe either way. Then there's agnosticism based on rationality. That's more like it just doesn't make sense to believe either way, given what we know. And there's even agnosticism based on probability. So you might think one side is more likely, but still not enough to fully commit to a belief.
Wow, so it's not passive at all. It's about actively engaging with the reasons why we can't know for sure.
Yeah.
That's way more interesting than just not having an opinion.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that the question is complex and we just don't have all the answers yet.
Okay, so we've got atheism taking a stand against the existence of God, and agnosticism, recognizing the limits of our knowledge about God. But before we jump into the arguments themselves, there's one more thing we need to talk about, the concept of God itself.
You got it. It's not just as simple as, like, God or no God. There are all sorts of different ideas about what God even
Hold
means.
on. We're not just talking about one God here. My philosophical brain is already starting to hurt.
It can be a lot to wrap your head around. I mean, think about all the different gods across cultures, philosophies, religions, each one with different attributes, different powers, different roles. And that leads us to another distinction: local atheism versus global atheism.
Okay, now you're just throwing fancy words at me. Local and global. Come on, break it down for us non-philosophers.
All right, all right. So think of local atheism like denying the existence of one specific God. For example, someone might say, I don't believe in that God of classical theism, the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good creator God. They're specifically rejecting that one idea of God, not necessarily all of them.
So it's like saying, I don't believe in unicorns, but I might believe in, like Pegasus. You're rejecting one mythical creature, but not the whole category.
Perfect analogy. Now, global atheism is it's a bit more ambitious. It's denying the existence of any god, no matter how you define it. It's like a blanket statement covering every possible god concept, even ones we haven't even thought of yet.
Whoa, that's a big claim. I can see why that would be harder to argue for. How could you ever disprove every single idea of God out there?
That's the challenge with global atheism. It really forces us to think about what we can and can't know and what it even means to, like, disprove something so big and abstract.
Okay, so local atheism is about specific God concepts, and global atheism is about, like, all gods, period. It's like atheism on a spectrum, you know?
Exactly. It's all about those nuances and understanding the concepts in detail.
All right, so we've got the groundwork laid, we've unpacked atheism, agnosticism, and even the idea of God itself.
Mm.
Now let's get to the good stuff, the arguments themselves. What are some of the arguments for agnosticism?
So one really interesting argument for agnosticism comes from Anthony Kenny, a philosopher. He basically said, look, neither the arguments for God nor the arguments against God are really convincing enough for me to say for sure. Like, he looked at both sides and just wasn't persuaded by either one. So he landed on suspending judgment, figuring that was the most rational thing to do.
So it's not like he's saying no one can know. It's more like his own take on the arguments, right? He's saying, I've looked at the evidence and I'm just not convinced.
Exactly. He wasn't claiming to know something about everyone's ability to know. It was more about his own experience grappling with the arguments and evidence. Just because he couldn't find a convincing argument doesn't mean there isn't one out there.
Yeah, makes sense. Shows how important it is for everyone to kind of explore these ideas themselves and figure out what makes sense to them. Someone else might come along and have a totally different take on the evidence or find some new piece of the puzzle that changes everything.
For sure. That's what's so cool about philosophy. It's always changing, always growing. What might seem like an unsolvable mystery today could totally be explained by some new discovery or perspective tomorrow.
It's a good reminder to, stay open-minded and be willing to consider new ideas.
Yeah.
But Kenny's argument makes me wonder, is just not being convinced really enough to justify being agnostic? Are there other things that might influence our beliefs besides just, like, the logic of an argument?
Ooh, that's a good question. Gets at the heart of, like, the relationship between reason, belief, and personal experience. Can we figure out God's existence just through logic alone, or are there other things going on?
Definitely adds another layer of complexity, that's for sure. But for now, maybe we should shift gears a bit. Let's look at some arguments for atheism, specifically local atheism, the kind focused on that God concept that philosophers usually talk about.
Yeah, sounds good. There are a couple arguments that actually suggest omnitheism, the belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God, is probably false. They're called the low priors argument and the decisive evidence argument.
Okay, those names are intriguing, to say the least. Let's take them one at a time. First up, the low priors argument. What's that all about?
So the low priors argument basically says the idea of omnitheism is just not very likely because it's so specific. Think about it. A God with all those characteristics, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, that's incredibly specific, incredibly detailed.
It's like winning the lottery and picking the exact numbers instead of just like any winning combination. The more specific you get, the less likely you are to be right.
Exactly. Now, compare that to a more general idea like source physicalism.
Yeah.
That just says the physical world came first. Way broader concept, fewer specific claims. The low priors argument says that kind of general idea is actually more likely to be true.
So even if we don't have direct evidence that disproves God, the fact that omnitheism is so complex and specific makes it less plausible than a simpler explanation for how the universe came to be. Kind of like Occam's razor, right?
Yeah.
The simplest explanation is usually the best.
Right on. It's about thinking about probabilities based on how complex the ideas are. Now, the decisive evidence argument, that one's all about looking at the world around us, specifically the mix of good and evil we see everywhere.
Ah, yes, the classic problem of evil. If there's an all-powerful, all-good God, why is there so much suffering? Always a tough one to reconcile.
The decisive evidence argument goes right at that problem. It says this mix of good and evil we see actually fits better with a God who's motivated by aesthetics, rather than just pure goodness.
Wait, a God motivated by aesthetics? Didn't see that one coming. I'm going to need you to unpack that a bit for me.
Okay, so imagine like a cosmic artist or storyteller who's trying to create something really captivating. A good story, a truly gripping one, needs conflict, needs drama, needs a bit of darkness to balance the light. This God wouldn't necessarily be evil, but their main goal isn't making everything good. It's making a really interesting, complex story.
Okay, I think I see what you mean. If God was all about making everything good, wouldn't the world just be like pure happiness, no suffering?
Exactly. The fact that there's evil, especially pointless suffering that doesn't seem to serve any purpose, that really challenges the idea of an all-powerful, all-good God. It fits way better with the idea of a creator who wants to, craft a really compelling story.
Yeah, that really changes how we think about the problem of evil. It's like the world's a stage for some cosmic drama, and we're all just playing our parts.
It's a powerful image, right? Really shows the implications of the decisive evidence argument. If it's true, then our whole understanding of God, morality, our place in the universe, it all gets turned upside down.
Yeah, my brain is definitely doing some somersaults right now. So we've got these arguments suggesting that maybe when we're talking about this traditional God, atheism is the more probable position. But here's a question that's been bugging me. Does probability equal rational belief? Like, even if atheism is more likely, does that mean it's actually rational to believe it?
That's the million-dollar question. It gets into this really complex relationship between probability, rationality, and what we choose to believe. It's not a simple equation. Just because something is likely doesn't mean it's automatically rational to believe it. There's more to it than that.
So we're going even deeper down the rabbit hole. Definitely want to explore that more. But maybe this is a good spot to take a break. We've covered a lot of ground today, unpacking definitions, exploring different kinds of atheism and agnosticism, and even getting into some pretty heavy arguments.
We have. Definitely a good foundation for some more exploration.
And I'm ready to keep going.
Huh.
Let's pick up this philosophical thread in our next segment and see where it takes us. All right, so last time we were kind of stuck on this question. Just because atheism might be more likely, does that automatically mean it's rational to believe?
Right, and that's where this argument against strong agnosticism comes in. It basically says, if we've got good reasons to think atheism is probably true, then it should be okay, rationally speaking, to believe it.
So it's like challenging the idea that we always have to stay neutral, even when like the evidence leans one way. But you mentioned some tricky parts to this idea, right?
Yeah, definitely. One that's really interesting is this idea that rational belief might not be what they call closed under conjunction.
Closed under conjunction. Okay, that sounds pretty philosophically technical. I think you're going to have to break that down for me.
Okay, so think of it like this. You can have a whole bunch of individual beliefs, each one totally rational on its own. But then the belief that all of those beliefs are true together, like the combination of them all, that might not actually be rational.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following. Got an example, maybe something a bit more concrete?
Sure. Imagine a huge lottery, like millions of tickets sold. You look at each person who bought a ticket and you think, okay, it's super unlikely this person will win. And you'd be right. For each individual person, the odds of any one person winning are like astronomically small.
Yeah, that makes sense. Winning a lottery like that is, well, not very likely.
Exactly. But if you then take a step back and say, therefore, it's rational to believe that no one will win, well, now you've got a problem because someone has to win the lottery, right? That's how it works.
Oh, I see. So even though it's rational to think each person probably won't win, when you put all those beliefs together, it leads to something that can't be true.
Right. It shows how rationality isn't always like straightforward and additive. Just because each individual belief is rational doesn't mean believing all of them together is also rational.
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So how does this conjunction thing connect back to the argument about agnosticism?
Well, it throws a bit of a wrench in things. Even if we have strong reasons to think atheism is probably true, like from those arguments we talked about or other evidence, This idea of conjunction makes us wonder if it's really automatically rational to just believe in atheism because of that.
So even if all the pieces seem to point toward atheism being likely, the act of actually believing it, based on all those pieces together, might not be as simple, rationally, as we thought at first.
Exactly. It adds this whole other layer of complexity to the debate and makes us really think hard about what it means to form beliefs rationally.
Well, this deep dive has been a real whirlwind of philosophical thinking. We started with what seemed like simple terms, atheism and agnosticism, and man, did things get complicated fast.
For sure. We saw how atheism, at least how philosophers see it, is more than just not believing in God. It's about making this positive statement saying God doesn't exist. And we explored all those different versions of agnosticism, showing how it's not just about being indecisive, but about recognizing that we don't know everything and wrestling with the limits of what we can know.
We even took a trip through the vast world of different God concepts, seeing how there's no one-size-fits-all definition of God. And the arguments about atheism can change a lot, depending on which God you're talking about.
We really got into the arguments too, looking at both sides. We looked at arguments for agnosticism, like Anthony Tenney's take on the evidence, and arguments for local atheism, like those low priors and decisive evidence arguments. And then, of course, we got to this fascinating question about probability and rational belief, and that whole mind-bending concept of closure under conjunction.
Man, we've touched on some seriously huge, fundamental questions that people have been asking forever. And always happens in philosophy, I feel like we've ended up with even more questions than when we started.
That's the beauty of it, though, right? Philosophy is all about this ongoing search for understanding, always exploring new ideas. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about the journey itself.
Couldn't agree more. So, for everyone listening, the journey definitely doesn't end here. Keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, keep thinking about these big ideas. You never know what kind of insights you might uncover along the way.
Who knows? Maybe you'll even find your own answers to those age-old questions about belief, knowledge, and what this whole universe is really all about.
What a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into atheism and agnosticism. Until next time, keep those philosophical wheels turning.